Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning still. Welcome to Politifest 2024, Can Our Government Meet the Moment? I'm Mackenzie Elmer, and I'm the environment reporter at Voice of San Diego, and it's great to be here with you today. In case you're not familiar with us, Voice of San Diego is a nonprofit investigative news organization committed to holding public officials accountable and giving you, the public, the information you need to be advocates for good government. As a nonprofit, we depend on members and donors and sponsors like you to make our work possible, so thank you for your support. I'd like to take a minute to recognize our sponsors who've helped make Politifest possible. A special thanks to the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of San Diego for being our partner for a 7th year. Our thanks also to the Sequan Band of Kumeyaay Nation, the United Domestic Workers Union, AARP, the San Diego Foundation, Business for Good, Hitski Development, the San Diego Municipal Employees Association, and the Asian Business Association, Planned Parenthood of the Pacific Southwest, Atlantis Group, and SD Art Matters, and the Southern California Rental Housing Association. We'd also like to recognize KPBS and iNewsSource, our partners in Public Matters. And we are participating to share content, conversation, and events like Politifest to ensure all San Diegans understand their opportunity to participate in the democratic process, and that it means more than voting in an election. So, if you're unable to attend any of the sessions in person, don't worry, we'll be posting the recordings to the Politifest page of our website next week. We welcome your questions, so we have volunteers that will have a basket with note cards and pens. Just raise your hand and they will bring you one. Write your question clearly on a note card, and then they will collect them to be read. Hopefully we'll try to get through as many as possible. You can also tweet along with the session and share your experience by using hashtag Politifest2024 on social media. Tag us on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, whatever you use. Now allow me to, I'm sorry. CalMatters has these fun worksheets they're passing out. So in case you want this to feel more like school on a Saturday, you can play around with those. And then now allow me to introduce our moderators. We have Deborah Brennan from CalMatters and Voice of San Diego. And we have Wendy Fry, also from CalMatters, both reporters who are going to educate us on propositions here today. So let me advance your slides.
Yeah, thank you so much. Like she said, I'm Wendy Fry. I'm a reporter at CalMatters, and we are a nonpartisan news site. Like our friends at Voice of San Diego, we are also nonprofit, which means we depend on donations to do our job and also members. One of the things that we do that's really popular with our readers is our voter guide, and that's what you're getting a little bit of sample of our voter guide that's online, where you can go look up all the propositions. We also have local ballot measures depending on where you are. You can type in your location, San Diego, and all your local measures will come up. A ton of information on that voter guide, like who's for and against each proposition, how much money has been raised on each proposition. So definitely check that out. If you like what you see there, please consider becoming a member. And we are going to run through. Deborah is also a colleague. She does half Voice of San Diego and half CalMatters. We both have a newsletter that we love doing, and we're excited to tell you guys about these ballot measures today.
Okay, so I'm going to start off with Proposition 2. So on this ballot, there are 2 blockbuster bond measures, both $10 billion each. The first one, Measure 2, or Proposition 2, would authorize the state to issue $10 billion in bonds to build new schools and fix or upgrade existing schools. Most of that, $8.5 billion, would go to K-12 schools. Another $1.5 billion would go to community colleges. So campuses have to provide matching grants to get that money. And the spending priorities include removing lead, upgrading seismic safety, adding air conditioning and broadband access, and building career technical facilities. So these are a lot of nuts and bolts improvements that schools are in need of. So the background on this is that school funding makes up the biggest chunk of the California State General Fund, but that only covers salaries and operational costs. It doesn't cover infrastructure. Any infrastructure, any construction of new schools, modernization, upgrades, needs to be paid through local and state bonds. So that's where this comes in. And it's a little bit tricky because wealthier, bigger school districts that have a larger property tax base have an easier time passing these bonds. Small, rural, low-income school districts find it a little bit harder to get that money through bond measures. So the supporters of this include the California Teachers Association, the Community College League of California, and a number of other supporters that you can see in the CalMatters ballot measure guide. But those are some of the key ones. And basically what they're saying is that thousands of California schools have leaky roofs, broken gas lines, faulty electrical lines and plumbing, and even lead or asbestos contamination. Students need a safe environment to learn, and they perform better in clean, modern schools. So the opponents is basically the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. And they don't necessarily refute the need for those improvements, but they disagree with the manner of paying for it. They say bonds are an expensive way to build infrastructure. It will saddle California taxpayers with billions of dollars of debt for decades to come, and that these improvements should be made through the general fund. Of course, that would require a whole-scale change to the way California pays for schools. So that's not on the ballot, but they're saying that that this isn't the best way to pay for schools. So the ballot measure is asking whether voters want to spend this $10 billion to upgrade California's campuses.
Cool. And we were going to talk back and forth a little bit about that. Was one of the things we were going to do is just sort of chat about it. So $10 billion sounds like an astrological number out of, way a lot, but it doesn't mean that they have to spend it, right? I mean, right, it's going to be on a case by case. They're authorized to issue these bonds.
They're authorized to issue the bonds, and it doesn't actually specify either how much they'll issue or what the repayment rate will be. That depends on the prevailing interest rates when they issue them.
Right. And then there's been some restrictions too. And Will Carles and I did a story one time for Voice of San Diego about the way they were structuring the bonds. And that's been kind of limited now at the state, I think. So these bonds would be a better repayment structure, I think, for voters than they were in the past. Is that?
That's a good question.
Yeah, we'll have to check that out. But those are the rundowns on that one. That's good.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to go on to...
Which one's the next one? Is it Prop 5?
Prop 5.
Prop 5. Okay, thank you so much. Mackenzie's flipping through the things because we didn't put them exactly in order. So this one's a big one for San Diego. So Prop 5, local bonds for affordable housing. It makes it easier for local governments to borrow money for affordable and supportive housing and the infrastructure. So that would include, water lines or public safety facilities, utilities, parks, anything that goes with these new measures. Historically, in order to pass something like this, you'd need to get 2/3 of voters to approve for it. This ballot measure says that we should lower the threshold for the number of people who approve the bond from 2/3 voters to 55%. So it would still need more than a majority, but the threshold is going to be lowered. So an earlier version of this measure that they tried to put forward to voters included also local taxes, sales tax, parcel tax. However, they negotiated and they eliminated those two, the tax and the parcel taxes, and scaled it back to only including bond measures. So it's been limited a little bit. The people that are in support, or the organizations that are in support of this, are the California State Building Construction Trades, California Housing Partnerships, and California YIMBY. And their argument for it is that it's undemocratic, basically, to allow 1/3 of voters to hold up these projects that might bring more affordable housing. Obviously, there's a huge housing crisis in the state, and they don't want, 1/3 of the voters to hold up these public works projects or hold them hostage, basically. And then Prop 5 would give local governments kind of more control over when they pass a bond measure. And the opponents of this are the California Chamber of Commerce, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, the National Federation of Indie Business, and of independent businesses, sorry. So California their argument against this is that California already has $500 billion in state and local debt, and this measure could increase property taxes. It could hurt homeowners and the local economy businesses. So those are the for and against. The spending on this is kind of interesting. So one of the organizations that was against it in the beginning, because they had the local sales, the local tax included, has since changed their position to neutral. But before they changed their position to neutral, they donated a bunch of money to the campaign to defeat it. And so the amount of money that's been raised, it's like $5 million for and like $30 million against. However, because I think it was the California Realtors Association changed their position, so now, taking them out of the equation, they had given $19 million. So taking them out of the equation, it's probably about $5 million to $4 million or so as far as the spending or the amount that's been raised to defeat it. And according to a poll by the Public Policy Institute of California, it's very close. The amount of likely voters that support it is 49%, and the 50% are against it right now.
Yeah, and this has kind of an interesting local angle as well. The San Diego City Council had considered floating a local bond measure to improve stormwater systems to prevent the kind of flooding that occurred this last winter, but they pulled that because there was another ballot measure that would have affected this, and under the current circumstances, they didn't feel like they'd be able to pass it.
Right. So this could have a lot of impact locally, basically. This is something that the city of San Diego has wanted to put forward to be able to clear out Chollas Creek and prevent the kind of flooding that we saw during the storms this past winter.
Okay,
move on to the next one?
Yes. So we're going to move on to Proposition 3, the constitutional right to marriage. So what this does, it amends the California Constitution to recognize the right to marry regardless of sex or race. And it removes language in the California Constitution defining marriage as a legal union of a man and a woman. So this is basically a redo of Prop 8, which was a 2008 state ballot measure that defines marriage as solely between a man and a woman. So if, as you may recall from that era, if some of you probably weren't old enough to be following it at the time, but many of us were, that was part of a complicated period in California history in which same-sex marriage was outlawed, briefly legalized following a state Supreme Court decision, outlawed again, and banned when Proposition 8 passed, shutting down same-sex marriage in California for years. Then in 2015, the Supreme Court legalized same-sex marriage, making California's ban moot. So fast forward to 2022, when the new conservative majority on the Supreme Court overturned federal abortion protections when it reversed Roe v. Wade. Now, that didn't specifically affect same-sex marriage, but it raised a lot of concerns that the court would revisit earlier decisions on privacy and due process rights. And in fact, Justice Clarence Thomas argued in a concurring opinion that the court should review its rulings on contraception and same-sex marriage. So Prop 3 would preempt that by enshrining marriage rights in the California state constitution. Supporters include ACLU, Planned Parenthood, League of Women Voters, a number of healthcare and civil rights organizations are for this. And their argument is that it removes discriminatory language from the California Constitution and reinforces California's commitment to marriage equality and the ability to marry the person you choose. They say it would also signal California's commitment to support its LGBTQ community. Opponents include the California Family Council and the American Council of Evangelicals. They say legalizing same-sex marriage could open the door to child marriages or polygamy. Now, to be clear, that's not on the ballot. That is not part of this proposition. So that's not what you're voting on. But these groups are predicting that could happen down the line if same-sex marriage is officially enshrined in the Constitution. They also argue that it's already legal, so it doesn't need to be changed in the Constitution. And then the funding for this includes about nearly $3 million in support of it, and no committees identified against it as of the 17th.
I'm definitely old enough to remember that. I think that was one of the first stories I covered as a reporter, is going down to the same-sex couples were getting the licenses from the county to get married, and there was a protest, and I remember when this was still a fight. But yeah, so it's interesting that a lot of people might think, like, what do we need this for, right? This has been going on, and what do we need to kind of codify it? But it's to the point of the Supreme Court could do whatever they want at some point.
Yeah, it went back and forth for a few years there, and there were some people who married during that brief hiatus who were kind of grandfathered in, but then after that, there was about 7 years during which people could not formalize same-sex marriages. So people are saying this needs to be changed. It's outdated, discriminatory language in the Constitution, and it needs to be updated.
Cool. All right. And so I think we're moving through these fast because there's a lot of propositions. So we wanted to leave enough time for questions and stuff. I think the next one, are we going to Prop 6 next? Yeah. Thank you, Mackenzie. Okay. So this, Proposition 6, this is part of a proposition that came out of the recommendations of the State Reparations Task Force that I've been covering a lot for several years. And it would amend the California Constitution to remove rules that allow jails and prisons to use forced labor. So basically, it's one of the last vestiges of slavery that's allowed in the Constitution says, the California Constitution says, we do not allow slavery except for as punishment of a crime. And so the Reparations Task Force recommended that language be removed. One of the arguments is, like, how can we atone for the past if we're not willing to, like, make sure it's not happening right now? And so it would prohibit discipline for inmates who refuse to work in the state prison systems. Again, this is aimed at sort of remedying the harms that California perpetuated of slavery. And the state wasn't a slave state, as you probably know, but it does have a very big history of racial discrimination, and it allows jails and prisons to force inmates to work, often for free or very, very minimal pay, in jobs that are actually pretty dangerous. Like, one of them is fighting wildfires. Other states have banned forced prison labor. And the idea here is that they would create like a voluntary system for people to work in the jails and prisons, and you would get credits or points or good behavior, different kind of incentive programs, rather than forcing a punishment or having to go to solitary confinement or something for refusing to do your job. The supporters of this are the ACLU, the California Legislative Black Caucus. This is one of the bills that they backed in their 14 priority package to start the process of reparations for California. Also, the Anti-Recidivism Coalition. And their argument is Prop 6 ends a last vestige of slavery and allows prisoners to turn down dangerous work that doesn't contribute anything to their future job skills. The opponents would be the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association, and they don't have any official opposition statement, but there has been lawmakers who have said that it would be too costly to pay inmates minimum wage. So that's why they negotiated this to create a voluntary program instead of, at one point, the Department of Finance had come up against it because they said it would cost $11.5 billion to pay inmates a minimum wage. But so they negotiated this to more of a voluntary type program where people can get incentives. But there's still some lawmakers who say it'll make it harder for prison wardens to manage prisons, or people, correctional officers to manage people. Spending for this, I was just talking to my editor about this too, that there hasn't been a bunch one way or another, people, supporting or trying to get people to vote yes or no on this. But the spending has been $955,000 for, 0 against. A statewide poll of likely voters by the PPIC says 46% of likely voters are planning to vote yes, and 50% are planning or are no on this measure at this point. And just one more point about it is, like, of the 90,000 inmates in the state prison system, about 40,000 of them are doing jobs like construction work, cooking, cleaning. They run the prison through that way. But the firefighting is also kind of a big part of this. They most earn 74 cents an hour. The inmate firefighters earn about $10 a day.
So one of the questions about this too is, or one of the justifications for prison labor is that it gives people skills they can use outside. But some of the inmates and their advocates say that that's not really the case, that they're given hard, dirty jobs that don't really build their skills. What can you tell us about that?
Right. So definitely with the firefighting, I've been actually going through all the corrections emails for a couple months. I think I got this huge dump of public records of like thousands and thousands of emails from the California Department of Corrections. And one of the things you see in there is like, somebody will be sick and not feel like fighting a fire that day. Like that's very hard, heavy, sweaty, difficult, hard labor, right? And they'll have some kind of punishment, or they'll be put, it's kind of like a retaliation that they aren't able to go do that hard job for the day. And then again, like you said, it's some of the jobs aren't, cooking. You might be able to get a job as a cook after you get out of being incarcerated, but it sort of depends on a lot of different factors in the system of who gets assigned to what job. And so, yeah, it could be very difficult work for the day or for the long term.
Yeah, and you brought up the point too that people are disciplined or punished for not working when they're sick or when it's a dangerous situation. So that's one of the other concerns. It's not just that they aren't doing their job, but they are protesting the conditions under which they're required to work.
Yeah, and I think the other really super big point, sorry not to belabor this one, this is just the one that I've studied the most because I've been covering it, is just, because there's been this effort at reparative justice, the lawmakers, the California Legislative Black Caucus and the lawmakers who are trying to put forward reparations legislation has said, how can we say we want to repair this past thing when we're still sort of allowing this forced labor to go on in our state? So it's sort of a little bit symbolic as well.
Okay, so our next ballot measure is Proposition 4, which covers drinking water, wildfire, and climate response. So this is another big ballot measure, another big bond measure that's on this year's ballot. It would authorize $10 billion in general obligation funds for water, wildfire prevention, and protection of public lands. Of that, about half would go to water and wildfire. $3.8 billion would go to improve water quality and protect California from floods and droughts, to help stave off the water crisis that's been worsened by climate change. Another $1.95 billion would pay to prevent wildfires, which have also become more frequent and destructive as the result of climate change. The rest would protect parks, wildlife, coastal areas, estuaries, and ocean resources, and support clean energy development and agriculture. So it's kind of a big grab bag of additional uses for that bond money. So background on this is Governor Gavin Newsom has made climate action one of his signature issues. He has, since he came into office, he has championed renewable energy, electric vehicles, and the like. But this year he scaled back some of the funding for that in order to cut back the state's projected $68 billion deficit. So as part of that, he slashed $9 billion from a $54 billion climate action package that the state legislature had previously approved. So proponents of this bond measure say this would backfill this. That would help fill that gap. And so there's wide agreement that California's infrastructure is in need of a makeover. California's biggest water investment, the State Water Project, began construction in the 1950s. So the state really hasn't had a big investment in water for about half a century. And a lot of proponents argue that the state needs to update it to adjust to changing patterns of precipitation and snowmelt that also are the result of climate change. Wildfires have also gotten worse, and 7 million acres have burned in California over the past decade. So the proponents say we need to put some major resources into preventing those or fighting those or preparing for them. Supporters include the National Wildlife Federation, California Professional Firefighters, and Clean Water Action. So they point out that about 1 million Californians lack safe drinking water, and more than half the state's rivers and streams are polluted. So spending money to improve water resources and prevent wildfire saves money and protects California in the long run, and protects the residents of California as well from those harms. The bonds would cover infrastructure for water recycling, stormwater capture, and desalination of brackish water, which are all ways of expanding the existing sources of fresh water. The opponents, again, includes the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association, as well as State Senate Minority Leader Brian Jones, a San Diego lawmaker here. Again, they say that bonds are the most expensive way to fund public works projects and that these programs should be built into the general fund. And then the spending on this has been $690,000 in support and no committees in opposition. So this one hasn't attracted a lot of financing.
The only thing I wonder about it too, though, is like we have how many water districts in the state? We have like all these some water districts that are super tiny, right? And then yet we still have so many people, more than 1 million, did you say, without safe drinking water in the state of California. It really makes you shake your head as far as, we have like the 6th or the 5th largest economy in the world, and we have people who can't just turn on their faucet and drink water.
Yeah, exactly. There's just shy of 40 million Californians. That means more than 2% of people in the state don't have safe drinking water. So clearly, most parties can agree that's a problem. But there just hasn't been the money to make those upgrades.
Cool. Okay. And then going on, I think this is the next one, 32, are we doing? Or yeah, is the next. Okay. Yeah. So raise the minimum wage. This one you probably have heard a lot about already. This one raises the state minimum wage for employers with 26 or more employees. It raises it to $17 now and $18 in 2025. For employers with 25 or fewer, it is $17 in 2025, $18 in 2026. The state has adopted minimum wage increases. I'm sure you've heard of this. $15 an hour in 2022, and then that rose to $16 an hour this year. And that's more than twice the federal minimum wage, but of course that's offset by, we all know that there's a very huge cost of living in California. Fast food workers received that $20 an hour for minimum wage, and healthcare workers on April 1st, or they're actually eventually, because the state, they were supposed to get us a minimum wage increase to $25, and the state has put that off. Inflation, again, has made those wage increases not quite as big as they originally had seen. This one's the one that's interesting because both sides are arguing inflation. Even the supporters and the opponents both say that inflation's a big problem. They just view it differently as far as, so the supporters are California Labor Federation, One Fair Wage, the California Democratic Party. Many minimum wage earners are the heads of their households, and they can't earn enough to support themselves or their families, even if they are working full time. And so supporters of this argue that it will boost the local economy, give people more money in their pocket to spend. Opponents of this are the California Chamber of Commerce, the California Restaurant Association, and the California Growers Association. And they are also they say that raising the minimum wage worsens inflation, and that the extra costs that the businesses have, they are going to go ahead and pass those on to consumers, and to, restaurant goers, people who are eating out, and that small businesses suffer when this happens. So, this has been an ongoing debate throughout, California for a long time. According to MIT Living Wage Calculator, a person living in the cheapest county in California would need at least $20.32 an hour just to afford the basics. So that's just to barely get by. Campaign 4 has raised $609,000, and against is $65,000. The PPIC poll of likely voters, it's a very close race on this one. Again, it's 50% of likely voters say they support this, 49% say they do not. This has been something, they've had this for years going on of the minimum wage and raising it. And so that when it first started happening, there was all this, oh, everything's going to close, all these restaurants are going to close, but I don't think we've seen that happen as they've raised the minimum wage. So
it's interesting that both sides of this argument are playing the inflation card. So the proponents say we need a higher minimum wage to keep up with inflation so that people who are relying on these minimum wage jobs can afford to live in the state. And the opponents are saying this will worsen inflation, it will raise costs for everyone, and force businesses to close or eliminate jobs.
So you guys get to decide on that, how you want to vote. The next one, are we
35? This is healthcare spending. This one is pretty straightforward. It regulates how the state spends money from healthcare plans. So the state taxes healthcare plans, and then this would govern how it uses that money. It would require the state to spend the money on medical services for low-income Californians and people with disabilities. And it prevents the state from using the tax revenue to replace existing Medi-Cal funding. So they can't just take this tax money and backfill it and then spend existing Medi-Cal money on something else. They would have to augment what they're spending on Medi-Cal. So about a third of Californians use Medi-Cal for healthcare, but payments to medical providers have flatlined. Because of that, many healthcare providers won't treat Medi-Cal patients. So even though people have coverage, they find it hard to get a doctor to see them or get an appointment. A group of doctors, hospitals, and clinics put this issue on the ballot in hopes of raising reimbursement rates and making healthcare access improved. Supporters include the California Medical Association, the California Hospital Association, California Dental Association. They say Prop 35 will reduce the month-long wait time to see doctors, prevent the closure of healthcare and clinics, and reduce overcrowding of emergency rooms. There's also been a lot of coverage recently about the closure of maternity wards in California, so that's another important healthcare issue. And this measure is in the unusual position of receiving support from both political parties. There are no official opponents that are listed with the Secretary of State, but Governor Gavin Newsom has signaled that he's not in favor of it. He said it hamstrings the state's budgeting efforts and its flexibility during a period of deficit, and that it would limit future legislatures from using tax money as they think is best. The total amount reported for this, in support of this, was $48.4 million. So
raised.
The amount raised in support of this was more than $48 million. There are no opposition committees identified, so there's no official fundraising against it.
Yeah, and I don't have a comment about this specific ballot measure, but it just made me think, so we have this amazing data journalist, Jeremiah, who pulls all this data from the Secretary of State, and he's developed a system to go through all the committees and find the committees and pull it all into one spot where you can just look up on our website on the voter's guide how much has been raised for or against. So that's a really cool tool, and a lot of reporters, even not CalMatters, are using it. So definitely check that out if you're wondering how much money has been going. This year has been less than years past, but there still is a lot of money going into these campaigns.
Yeah, and typically it can be confusing to go through the Secretary of State database and try to pull all the funding on your own because it's categorized in different ways that make it sort of labor intensive and confusing. So it's great to have that resource where it's all in one place and easily accessible.
And then I think we're going to Prop 33 next. This is the one that has made, I think, the strange political bedfellows. And it's also like, this is the third time a charm, maybe, possibly, or is the third time a charm for this one, because it's been on your ballot several different times. It would repeal an older law that limits rent control and allow, that's a very important word there, that it would allow cities to impose rent control. They wouldn't have to, but they could on any rental units, including single-family homes and new apartments. So the background on this is that there's that Costa-Hawkins law, the 1995 law that limits how cities can impose rent control, right now cities can't set it on single family homes or apartments that were built before 1995. As we all know and have all probably felt, that the housing costs are soaring in California. 30% of Californians spend more than half of their income on rent, which you're not supposed to do. You're supposed to only spend like less than a quarter of it. Deborah checked out the median income or the median apartment rent in San Diego, and it was more than $3,000 a month, median average, just to rent, a regular apartment. That's per Zillow. So that is a ton of money. You'd have to make a ton of money to live here in San Diego. The supporters are Housing Now, Tenants Together, Consumer Watchdog, and that was their argument, is that, I think everybody involved in this debate agrees that more affordable housing is needed. I think the discrepancy here, or the disagreement, or the thing that's being fought, is what is the best way to get that affordable housing. The opponents of this, the California Small Business Association, the California Rental Housing Association, very oddly, Senator Tony Atkins, are opposed to this. They say that it discourages developers from building new housing, and it's going to hurt small mom and pop landlords. And I checked with Senator Atkins before this to see, because I wanted to make sure that I had exactly what her opposition was to it. And she said I'll look at it exactly so that I have it exactly what she said, and I don't misquote by memory, but I think it was about allowing cities to skirt state housing law. So let me just read exactly what, because I want to make sure I get this right, because it was surprising to me that, the language in this measure can undo and allow cities to not follow state housing law. It could undo a decade of critical work to actually build more housing. So that was what her opposition. So it's sort of created like these strange, bedfellows in politics you don't normally see cited, such a strong Democrat siding with Republicans on an issue like this. For is 41 million and against 67 million. So 67 million has been raised to defeat the measure, 41 to get it through voters. Like I said, an important clarification is cities aren't going to be required to set that rent control. It's just going to lift an old law that keeps them from doing it now. According to the PPIC statewide poll of likely voters, 51% are currently in favor, 46% are no, and 3% are undecided right now.
So that's obviously one of the hot button issues for funding. Those are some of the biggest numbers in terms of campaign contributions for or against that. That's obviously attracting a lot of attention from well-heeled donors.
Right. And like I said, this has been on your ballot, I think, 2 times in the past, and this is the 3rd time. So the backers of this have tried to get it through several times and have not been successful yet. So it'll be definitely interesting to see if it gets through this time.
So do you want to go straight to Prop 35, since that's kind of the
34? 34 is the companion one, right? The first one?
yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So there's like a little grudge match going on between 33 and 34. The people that are against 33 have put forward this proposition 34 on prescription drug revenues that requires certain providers to spend 98% of their revenues from federal discount prescription drug programs on direct patient care. So also it authorizes statewide negotiation of Medi-Cal drug prices. So it's a fight between state politicians and Michael Weinstein, who's the president of the Los Angeles-based AIDS Healthcare Foundation. So he's been a player in this state rent control efforts for many years. He's behind Prop 33, and the opponents say that he's using these revenues that he's getting from the federal discount program to back this measure to try to get the rent control through, and in a kind of the implication in kind of an improper way. So he's using this revenue that he gets from the federal discount drug program to fund his political crusades, and instead of caring for patients with AIDS, right? So that's what the people that are putting forward Prop 34 are saying. And they are pointing to news reports that say Weinstein's arguing for rent control when his own foundation, I think there was a story just this week from Liam Dillon, who, his own foundation is operating its own substandard rental units. So they say that he could start with his own buildings and put better apartments for his own tenants. He says that this measure is just a political hit job, right? That they're just doing this targeting just him, and it's backed by corporate landlords to silence his rent control efforts and his patient advocacy. For 34, the supporters are California Apartment Association, the ALS Association, the Howard Jarvis Taxpayer Association. They argue that the federal government gives drug discounts to healthcare providers on the agreement that they use that revenue that they earn to care for patients and not to, put forward ballot measures. The measure would provide accountability to make sure that they do that. The opponents are his as you would imagine, his own foundation, his AIDS Healthcare Foundation, is against this, and Consumer Watchdog. They say that this measure is just directed at his one organization, at the AIDS Healthcare Foundation, and it seeks to weaponize the initiative process to punish his nonprofit for trying to lower housing costs. So this one's pretty complicated. I mean, these two together, it's pretty complicated because you might, any voter, you might feel one way about an organization using the revenues they get from federal discount drug programs, but not necessarily agree with not lowering rents. So for it, the campaign for it is $26.8 million. Against it is $1.14 million. Polling data, 53% yes, 43% no, 4% undecided.
So it looks like there's the reasonable majority of Californians who want to see rent controls in place, who want to see rents stabilized at least from their current astronomical levels.
Yeah. It's just a disagreement over how to get there. And then on this one also, it looks like, 53% are in favor of limiting how much of the revenues are spent on actual direct patient care versus putting forward ballot measures.
So our final ballot measure will be Prop 36 that concerns retail theft and drug crime. So if you were in the earlier session in this room that was entirely about Prop 36, you probably got a very thorough understanding of what's at stake there and what the arguments are, but this is kind of the Cliff Notes version. So it does a bunch of things. It adds fentanyl to laws against trafficking hard drugs. It allows judges to impose longer sentences and send large-scale drug dealers to state prison instead of county jail. It reinstates strict penalties for dealers whose drugs kill or seriously harm a person. And it, as was discussed in the previous session, one of the big features is that it authorizes court-ordered, mandated treatment programs for people convicted of drug offenses. So they can choose whether the judge can force them to choose whether they want to accept a felony offense with incarceration or go through treatment. It also, so part of it deals with drug crimes. The other big part deals with what are called smash and grab robberies and shoplifting. So it allows judges to impose felony charges by combining smaller thefts that together total more than $950 or thefts committed by groups of people. So if several people are operating together to steal more than $950 worth of merchandise, they can be charged with felonies for that, even if their individual thefts are less than that threshold. So it basically combines two issues, the theft and robberies with the drug crimes. So Prop 36, as you may have heard, seeks to reverse the 2014 ballot measure Prop 47, which downgraded some drug and theft crimes from felonies to misdemeanors. And the goal was to reduce prison overcrowding. Shoplifting and commercial robberies rose in the following years. That's why you see razors and medicine locked up behind glass at pharmacies, although there was some dispute between the two panelists in the last panel about how much they really rose and where they're at now, particularly in San Diego. Meanwhile, deaths from fentanyl poisoning also soared as the potent opioid was added to street drugs. Recently, there's been a few news reports, like literally within the last week or so, that say that for the first time in many years, they've seen a little bit of a decline. So there's some hope that that trend may be on its way out. But this would reinstate stricter penalties to try to prevent fentanyl sources from getting into the streets. The supporters are big retailers such as Walmart, Target, and Home Depot. and a bunch of law enforcement groups, the California District Attorneys Association, California Correctional Peace Officers Association, and California Chamber of Commerce. They say that Prop 36 offers a graduated approach to sentencing theft and drug crimes. District attorneys such as Summer Steffen here in San Diego say it gives judges and prosecutors some leeway. They can decide to impose harsher charges or sentences on habitual criminals, but offer some second or third chances to occasional offenders. So they say this gives them the flexibility to look at the individual circumstances of the person who's being charged, as well as what crimes they committed, and decide where that falls on the spectrum of misdemeanors and felonies. And they also stress that by requiring mandated direct treatment sentences, it can force people to get help for addiction that they wouldn't seek help for on their own. The opponents include Governor Gavin Newsom, the ACLU of Northern California, the Alliance for Safety and Justice. They argue that Prop 36 would mark a return to the field war on drugs. It would increase prison populations without necessarily addressing the root causes of why these crimes are committed or why people become addicted. They say it would raise costs by putting more people in prison and restoring the incarceration costs. And it would also reduce money that had previously been dedicated to treatment programs and restorative programs for crime victims. Because the money that was saved from the prison, the reduction in prison populations, was mandated to be dedicated to schools, treatment programs, and restitution for crime victims. So they're saying if we're putting more people in prison, we're saving less money, less of that money goes to these social service programs that we want and need to reduce these problems.
Yeah, this one's like definitely one of the ones that's pulling more on emotional heartstrings, right? Because you have the mothers that are out there saying, you know, that they want people who have sold their children fentanyl to be prosecuted. And that's like a very big emotional argument. But I think what we heard in the last session, definitely from Attorney Jones Wright, is like to really look at, is it going to do what, you know, is it going to do what it says? And the thing that I was very surprised to hear too is her say that, you know, they do have the authority to put all these cases together and charge a bigger case if they wanted to. They're just not sort of because they want to see Prop 47 fail, I think is the point that she was, you know, that was the argument that she was making. So, and then the other emotional heartstring thing that they have too is, I mean, I'm sure like everyone in this room has gone into a CVS or a Target at some point and wanted to get some kind of personal care item, and it's locked up behind a case, and I think the proponents of it like kind of want you to blame, you know, and say, if you don't want this stuff locked up, you've got to vote this way on Prop 36. But I think it was very interesting, the last panel, maybe if you didn't catch it, watch it online, just to hear if it's actually going to make the changes, or if we're just kind of going back to the period of where we had war on crime, war on drugs.
Yeah, it was interesting because she was saying that the changes this makes are already within their authority. The other thing that she brought up that was kind of an argument between them, and I don't think it was resolved, was, are these crimes becoming more common because they're not being reported and they're just kind of allowed to continue without being enforced, or are they becoming more rampant because police officers and sheriff's deputies aren't responding when they get the calls? So that's kind of a big question that's not exactly resolved in this measure and would require a deeper dive into the data. And then another big issue that came up in that first panel that's worth considering is regards the mandated treatment. So this would provide people with the option to seek treatment instead of going to jail or prison. But both parties acknowledge there just isn't enough money for treatment programs right now. So that's going to be a struggle whether or not this passes.
I think we're done. We're done with all of them. Yeah. You guys made it through. Congratulations. Thank you for bearing with us through all of that heavy information.
So we're going to open questions now. So I'm going to introduce our Aaron Price Fellow. You've probably all gotten cards, and if you had a question, you could write it on the card and pass it to our host and moderators. We're going to have one verbal question, and that will be from the Aaron Price Fellow. Whose name I wrote down here? Max Kelson.
Yeah,
Max Kelson is going to come up and give and ask the first question. Each year, the Aaron Price Fellows Program selects 40 kind, inquisitive, open-minded ninth graders from a pool of 300 applicants for a 3-year journey. They go behind the scenes to see how cities function, explore the role of community members in shaping society, and develop empathy and skills for navigating a diverse world. The program is a high school leadership experience started in 1991 by the Price family. The mission of the Aaron Price Fellows Program is to prepare a highly motivated and diverse group of San Diego public high school students to be responsible, engaged, and caring members of their community. Today, there are over 1,000 Aaron Price Fellows alumni with 500 locally carrying out the mission of the program by making a difference in their families, careers, and communities. So please welcome Max to ask the first question.
Hello, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. My name is Max Carlson, and I am a senior at San Diego High School. As you mentioned, California voters have shut down Proposition 33 twice already. What's different with housing this year that makes this legislation especially impactful that might mean the measure passes?
Yes, thank you so much for the question. So, like I said, we have seen soaring rents. That's been going on for a long time in California. I think this year also you're seeing sort of more media attention, more news coverage. At least we've done a few big stories about the corporate landlords. So these big, huge, giant private equity fund, Blackstone, Greystar, huge funds that are coming in, buying it up. A lot of apartments, and then in some cases using software that sets the price for the apartment. So it used to be if you had an apartment complex that you had to get every empty unit rented right away. Like you didn't want a unit to sit there empty. Now they have a software that tells them exactly when, and they can leave it on the market until it's a good time to rent it to someone at $3,300 for a tiny little apartment. And so I think you're seeing more of the influence of corporate landlords. I will say, even though Atkins is against this measure, I know for sure that she's very much against these corporate landlords because she worked with us on the story a whole lot. And so I think that the disagreement is what is the best way to address that. Is it rent control, or is it? So, I mean, I think the Department of Justice is looking into this, the RealPage company, the price setting software company, but. So that is the decision before voters, is how is the best way to address these soaring rents that have kind of gotten out of control.
Rent control would also apply to single family homes, people renting not an apartment, but a single family home. And there's also been some attention paid to what some people call build to rent developments, where a subdivision of homes is built and immediately bought up by one of these equity firms that rents it. So they never go on the market for individual homeowners to buy. And that kind of puts a chokehold on the housing supply, because you have people who want to buy their own home and move into it, but there isn't enough supply at a reasonable price for them to buy, which then drives up apartment rents. So it's a kind of complex business environment in which this is occurring.
And definitely, if you guys have any other questions, we have a lot of detailed information on our voter guide.
Okay, we still have 20 minutes left. Okay, so I have a number of questions here from the audience and more incoming.
And we don't have to do all of them. We can go early to lunch.
No, we're staying through lunch. Okay. I'm not precisely sure which prop this was referring to. You guys are the experts, but they were just generally asking, how do the new bonds, perhaps Prop 5, affect the taxpayer? Is the effect evenly spread, or may some taxpayers pay more than others?
So it's on your property taxes. Well, some of them. It depends on the way the bond is structured, right? So it depends on what they actually put forward to voters. And I mean, and the important part of this is that it just allows the government, so it makes it easier for local governments to to put forward a measure to ask you, do you want this bond? It doesn't mean that they can just do whatever bond they want. It means on each bond that they want to put forward. So they have to come to you again individually with each of these bonds and say, do you want to do a bond for water infrastructure? And this is what the bond would be. All it does is lower the amount of voters that have to approve that from where it has been historically very hard to pass these measures, unless it's a school bond. But even in San Diego, it's very hard to pass these bond measures sometimes because you need to meet that 2/3 threshold. This proposition would lower the threshold to 55% of voters.
Right. So Prop 5 would change the formula for passing local bonds, and depending on what city or county you live in, you might pay different amounts because it depends on how much bond indebtedness your local government has incurred. But there's also the two state bonds, the Prop 2 and Prop 4, which address schools and water and wildfire. And those would be statewide. The state would take out the bonds, and then they would be paid back with state revenue over the next several decades. So they would have to build that debt service into the state budget. That wouldn't be paid individually by homeowners. All taxpayers would contribute, and it would come out of the state budget.
Another Prop 5 question, just because it's up. Someone asked, does Prop 5 apply to the 55-foot height limit west of the freeway? And that's a rule here where, no, go ahead.
I don't know for sure. I wouldn't put that. I'm not 100% sure on the answer to that. I wouldn't think so. But again, I think on each individual, it's not passing a bond. It's saying the government, the local government, your local government has to come to you with these bonds and say, do you want, yes or no, do you want to approve this? And now a less amount of people have to say, yes, we want to approve this than before.
Yeah, so it pretty much concerns government borrowing, not so much local zoning codes.
Okay, there's a lot of questions on Prop 4, a lot of water people in the audience. Would Prop 4, would the new resources be conveyed through state water project?
That's a good question. From my reading of the ballot measure, it doesn't specify the exact projects that would be funded through this. It's earmarked for various kinds of water improvements, but it doesn't specify exactly how the money would be spent or how the water would be conveyed. So it could be for a number of things. It presumably some of the water potentially could be conveyed through the state water project, but there's other local things like desalination, stormwater capture that probably would be local water projects that don't concern that state infrastructure.
Okay.
But the details of how the money would be spent and how the water improvements would be rolled out have yet to be seen.
They asked, has the Metropolitan Water District offered a position? I looked that up, and they did vote to support Proposition 4, just in case that wasn't directly on your cards. And then would local water districts apply for these funds somehow?
Typically, the bond funds are competitive. That's a good question. We'd have to look and see what the provisions are for how different water districts or different local agencies would qualify for the bond money. But typically, it's a competitive grant process.
Okay. Prop 32. Oops. Okay, for Prop 32, do tax cuts and credits come with raising the minimum wage to make the transition easier for them?
What? Do tax cuts?
Do tax cuts and credits come with raising the minimum wage? Does this have, to make the transition easier for them?
Easier for the workers?
I assume so.
For the business.
For the business,
small businesses?
probably? Yeah.
I did not see, I'm not sure about that one. I'm sorry. I did not see that written into the proposition. I guess that could be something that the state could consider doing if small businesses were struggling.
Yeah, I didn't see that as part of the proposition either.
Okay, 2 hot follow-ups on that. What happens to workers already making $17 and $18 an hour? Do they get raises too?
No, if they're making the minimum wage, then their minimum wage is set.
That's a bummer.
the minimum wage, not progressively everybody's pay.
And is there evidence that the price of goods will increase if the minimum wage is raised?
That's the argument of opponents, that if we raise the minimum wage, that restaurants, grocery stores, other retailers will raise prices in order to cover the cost of the labor.
Yeah, that's their argument. I mean, I think we've seen, I think that was their argument in the first place. And so anytime that they've had the minimum wage increase, I think that the argument has been, oh no, everybody's going to have to pay so much more and all the businesses are going to close. I don't know if we've seen that happen.
You guys are doing so good. I would be like, this is a lot. Okay, Proposition 2 questions. Do campuses have to provide matching grants to get the money?
Yeah, typically local school districts have to provide matching grants to get the state money, and this ballot measure would also require that. So what happens is they pass a local bond for a certain amount of, usually tens of millions of dollars, and then they would apply for matching state grants to help with whatever construction or modernization or repairs they need to do. That's actually one of the sticking points of this ballot measure because, as I mentioned, bigger, wealthier districts have the property tax base that enables them to pass bonds. Smaller, lower income ones don't. And so there are actually some small and rural school districts who have opposed this bond because they say that the funding formula favors the bigger districts and that they're at a disadvantage to compete for state bonds.
Did you also say, what % match would be required? Do we know?
I'm sorry, I don't have that number off the top of my head, but that...
Okay. Another question on this. What is the equity impact of requiring matching funds for school bonds? Is this unique to the prop or is it standard for school bond measures?
It is standard for school bond measures. And as we discussed, there's definitely equity issues in terms of who is able to qualify for the matching funds and how the formula works and which districts it favors and which districts it disadvantages. So there's been some effort to kind of rewrite the formula to give a little bit more credit to smaller districts with less of a property tax base, but it's unclear if that satisfies the equity concerns.
Okay, and this was an overall question on bonds. How well do bonds make the impact for which they were written versus become a misuse of money with little result?
Yeah, that's a great question.
That is a really good question. When I've covered local school bonds in the past, typically they will have a bond oversight committee that has to review all expenditures, all contracting, any hiring decisions that are made to make the repairs or construction that the bonds are financing, and those documents are all public records too. So I'm actually not sure if the state bond measures, create a state oversight committee as well.
But it is a very good point. I've definitely covered many stories where, in the Sweetwater School District, where the teachers are not the teachers, but the administrators are borrowing from the funds that's meant for construction to pay teacher salaries. And we've done a lot of stories about that in the past, in years past, about sort of the misuse of the bond dollars. It is definitely something that happens.
Yeah, and the bond dollars there's kind of this firewall between infrastructure and operational costs. So just as the state doesn't pay for infrastructure through general fund revenue for the most part, you cannot use bond money to pay salaries or any other operational costs like that. You can't use it for benefit salaries or any kind of personnel costs. But there have been cases where that firewall is breached. Yeah.
Okay, we have a Prop 36 question. Where is that? Okay. How would cutting funding to services such as employment assistance, housing, and school-based programs reduce crime? Because the bill would cut, I think, $100 million annually or something. Doesn't the new bill package signed by Newsom solve some of the crime issues?
Yeah, the Legislative Analyst's Office said there would be a significant cost. If you were in the previous session, you heard Genevieve Jones-Wright say it's about $100 million a year that's dedicated to social services through Prop 47. If this were reversed, there would be a cost somewhere between tens of millions and 100 million or so a year, depending on how it's rolled out. So there's definitely cost. I don't know that helps job creation or other goals. I think one of the arguments I talked to Summer Steffen about this bill, and she felt like there could be cost savings if you catch people early in their criminal activity. So if you prevent people from if you catch people when they're at the misdemeanor stage or at the early stage of theft or addiction, you prevent them from becoming more hardened criminals or becoming more habitual substance abuse users. And so she's saying if we can catch that early, we can prevent these criminal justice costs from rolling up in the first place.
To me, it kind of reminds me of that. It's something they say in recovery a lot, which is like the one you feed, like you're going to have more attention to the thing that you feed. So if you feed the educational system, if you feed programs for job assistance or in, even neighborhood revitalization, that's where your effort is going towards. And like, that's what you'll see flourish versus if if you're putting all the funding towards criminal justice, if you're putting all of the funding towards cracking down, that's what you're going to see. You're going to, it's like, it's the question is sort of philosophically, what do you want to feed?
And that's the concern that reversing Prop 47 would take money away from things that prevent people from committing crimes or becoming addicted in the first place.
Okay, we have about 9 more minutes. We're just going to burn through the rest of these. So Prop 32 question, again, so the person wanted to know, why is this $17 or $18 an hour still below a livable wage?
Yeah, so they have a living what is it? MIT living
Living wage calculator.
And so they basically calculate like what's the lowest amount you could possibly spend on electricity, what's the lowest amount you could spend on rent in the least expensive county, which I can't remember what it is. I think it's Merced or Central Valley area. I can't remember exactly what county, but if you live in that county, you're paying the lowest housing cost. Like, how much do you need to make to just pay your basics, not take vacations or have any kind of, extras, but just to pay your rent, pay your electric utilities, that kind of stuff. And that's the number that they calculate to be $20.32 an hour. And so the people that push the minimum wage increases are trying to get people to be able to make enough working full-time at one job to be able to meet their basic expenses.
So the idea would be to push the minimum wage closer to that threshold.
Then we have a Prop 34 question. Why not simply make it all providers?
Oh, so it is for all. It would be for all providers. It doesn't say in the proposition. This is just for the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. The president of that is just saying the reason why they're coming with this proposition is just to target me. But no, it's not true. It says just the AIDS Foundation is. Oh, I'm so sorry. My apologies. So only the AIDS Healthcare Foundation. Oh, so it's specific. It doesn't name them specifically, but the criteria, it's clear that it's specifically targeted just for him. Okay, so I'm sorry. I stand corrected, but yeah, so that is a good question, is if that really was the true intent, just why wouldn't they make it for everybody, for all providers?
There was one that I could not read, so I'm going to try to read what it sort of says, and if you want to speak up and correct me. Something are not $3,000. Where does that come from? Oh,
the apartments?
Where this is right? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah. So according to Zillow,
That's the number that Oh no, I've looked into apartments recently for my son. No, this is a number that came off of Zillow. That's the median for all apartments of all sizes, anywhere from 1 bedroom to several bedrooms. And that's the number they cite. Now, I don't have access to the data behind it, but I know from looking at rent recently for a child that a one-bedroom in the San Diego area runs at or close to $2,000.
Oh, okay.
No. That's
And for real people who just want one trick,
no.
Inflated.
Okay. The 3,000 addresses apartments of all sizes, not just one bedroom. So I'm saying a one bedroom is around 2,000. Bigger apartments presumably cost more.
Okay. So you're saying 3,000. Okay.
No, you should look
Okay.
at North Park.
Well, I just know, yeah. I mean, I know the apartment that I was renting was a one-bedroom apartment. It was 3,000. I rented it for a year, and then they tried to raise it to 3,300. She did some research on the median cost for Zillow. There are apartments that are less for sure, but they are going up. The amount is going up very quickly. They're now flat. Okay.
a nice article about. All I'm saying is, you guys only your response.
Zillow says the median rent for all bedrooms and all property types in California is $2,850.
Okay.
Median rent $2,850.
But that's still, and I don't know. You have to look into how Zillow calculating that. So what they
Okay. So you're saying it's lower than what we're saying?
it's a simple family law. So that it's very less than another easiest.
Yeah, I think
The houses we did, the houses started 3,000 and go at 5 and 6.
Okay.
Don't make me pull up Craigslist.
So apartments are that high? Okay.
well, I can't. We're quoting one source. We're not saying we independently researched that, but based on our personal experience, the apartments are in that range, and we're citing Zillow. So you can take issue with their calculations, but this is the number that they're saying.
And if they'll display that it's just the house.
It's
so
all
rents
property
aren't quite
types.
as high. They're lower, a little bit lower than. Okay.
There's a lot of, rent.com has the same number, even higher. There's a lot of, I think they're kind of falling in the same area. So give or take $200.
And I know that it's all the method odds cooked in America.
Okay. So
But here,
So quick.
talking about the cost of living and stuff like that, probably you and an apartment for yourself with no roommates to go get. There's a lot of distortions when you throw up.
okay.
It's a That's the
Okay, so the last question I'm going to throw at you. It's a Prop 4 question. The climate bond. I was just curious. So if we don't get this 10 billion in borrowing for the climate things we need to handle, what happens? Like, what do we lose? Do you know what's at stake?
Well, I think the proponents would say that what's at stake is our ability to adapt to climate change in terms of updating our water systems and bolstering our ability to fight wildfires. And I think opponents would say we just have to tighten our belt in a time of deficit and maybe find other ways to pay for those necessities. They also point out, I should note that the opponents point out that they agree that clean water and fire safety are necessities. They're not luxuries, and that's not something we can go without. But they're saying the state needs to find other ways to pay for it rather than passing a bond that would provide debt. Of course, the proponents are saying we have provided other ways to pay for it, but we had to cut them back because of the deficit, and so we need to make up that gap.
Okay. We only have a couple minutes left. There's I guess I'll just squeeze this in since we're going for it. On Prop 36, Prop 36 and other proposals have offered solutions for the haves and not the have-nots. All these proposals don't provide, for example, expanded drug recovery facilities. There's a lot of incentive only to create law enforcement, jobs, and record-breaking prison populations. Please comment. So that's not a question. That was more of a statement. But they wanted you to comment on that.
On Prop 36?
that the proposals offer solutions for more of the haves and the have-nots. They don't provide drug recovery facilities, but they do, crack down on people breaking the law, for instance, I think.
Well, that is the argument against it, and that's what you may have heard Genevieve Wright Jones discussed, saying that this would actually take money away from treatment, that there isn't enough treatment capacity right now. So that's her argument.
Okay. Well, thank you for this spicy debate, everyone. Thank you for joining us. The next session starts at 1:30. It will be me actually in here talking about the Tijuana River and whether the government can fix that. Help us spread the word by sharing our website, voiceofsandiego.org. If you've enjoyed today's session, sign up for our weekly newsletters. Deborah has one called the Sacramento Report, for instance. Thank you again to everybody and our volunteers.